Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Law News Network. I'm your host, Jesse Weber, and thanks for joining us today. A lot to cover today, a lot of special segments that we're going to be having today, and a lot to recap about the trials we are covering and will be covering here on the Law News Network. Let's first start off with what's happening from last week. As you know, we were covering every day the Luis Toledo case, this horrific case of a 35-year-old man who was charged with second-degree murder in the killing of his wife, Yesenia Suarez, and 2 counts of first-degree murder in the killing of her 2 children, Talia, who was 9 years old, and Michael, who was 8 years old. Even though the bodies of all 3 have never been found, and this was a case that was built by the prosecution to say that these 3 people were dead, and there was a lot of evidence to try and show the jury that they, in fact, Luis Toledo killed these 3 people. They were able to do it because on last week, on Friday, I believe, Luis Toledo was found guilty on all 3 counts, and another count of tampering with evidence. Now the question becomes, will he face the death penalty? As for anybody who was watching that trial last week, during this hearing phase, when the verdict came forward, Mr. Toledo told the judge, I just want to be sentenced to death already. I don't want to take up any more of the court's time. We're going to analyze a little bit, what does this mean for Mr. Toledo moving forward? But in the meantime, that's one thing we will be covering. Another case that we're also covering here on the Law News Network, as you know, is the Michigan v. Jeffrey Willis case. This really a bizarre case out of Michigan and very disturbing case. Mr. Willis has had, how should I say, quite the run-in with the law. He is first on trial now for the murder of Rebecca Blech. He's accused of shooting Blech several times in the head alongside Automobile Road in rural Muskegon County on June 29, 2014. Now, it was believed that Miss Blech was jogging at the time, and prosecutors say the motive for Mr. Willis here was to kidnap, sexually assault, and ultimately kill Blech, as they say he did to another woman, Jessica Haringa. Now this is a name for anybody who's been following this case. You would hear this name. Jessica Haringa disappeared from her gas station job in April of 2013, and Willis has been charged in the kidnapping and murder of Jessica Haringa. Now remember, for this case, it's very similar to the Toledo case in that the Haringa, her body has never been found. But that's not it for Willis. That's not it, because he is also charged with the abduction of a teenager who was walking along another rural Muskegon County road in April of 2016. This seems to happen every 2 years or every several years with this gentleman. Now he is charged with the potential abduction of this teenager. Luckily, she was not abducted. It was a potential abduction. She testified last week. So Mr. Willis is going to be on trial for that abduction. He's going to be on trial for the Jessica Haringa disappearance and murder. And now the first trial he is on trial for is the murder of Rebecca Blech. So this is a case where you have 3 different separate incidents that are all coming in together as one. We're going to talk a little bit about that case as well. Also, we have some special segments for you later on today. We're going to be talking about a lawsuit that is facing Facebook, and we're going to have our own Misty Marison to talk about this. It's an employment-related issue, a very interesting issue about employment law and Facebook. You're going to want to hear about this one. And then later on, there's some discussion from the Supreme Court about the death penalty and what is the factors about the death penalty for people who are indigent or do not have the proper resources to that maybe what more wealthy defendants might have. We're going to talk about that case. Also, there's 2 special segments that I will be covering right now. We will be discussing in a moment the Robert Mueller investigation that led to the indictment of Paul Manafort, President Trump's former campaign manager, as well as his business associate Rick Gates, and also President Trump's campaign foreign policy advisor, George Papadopoulos. So we're going to talk about all of these things and what does it really mean in this investigation. You hear things like Russia, collusion, Mueller, but we're going to try and make sense of it for you from a legal aspect and get you on the right path to understanding what all this means. And then we do want to preview another case that we hopefully will be covering today. Again, unfortunately in Willis, we do not have, it's not a live feed today. There was a delay in that case, and the reason there was a delay is there is a motion that will be heard. We'll talk about that. And the Luis Toledo case, now it becomes the sentencing phase in terms of the death penalty. And when does that begin? We'll talk about that. But there's another case that we might handle today. It's the case of Adam Matos. This is a case out of Pasco County, Florida. There he is right there. Adam Matos is a man who's been accused of brutally murdering his ex-girlfriend, Megan Brown, her boyfriend, Nicholas Leonard, and her parents, Gregory and Margaret Brown. This is pretty horrific. Brown was the mother of Matos' son, who was 4 years old at the time his mother was murdered. He faces the death penalty. We're going to get into that case. But you're not just going to hear from me, because this is so many different cases, so many different legal issues, and we want to talk about them all at once. And here to help me talk a little bit more about that is Adam Gana, the managing partner of Gana LLP. Adam, always great to see you, and thanks for coming back on the Law News Network.
Good morning, Jesse. How are you doing?
Doing great. Are you ready for the rundown? We have a lot to discuss.
I'm ready.
Let's first start off with Willis Toledo. That we had a verdict in that case last week. Now it becomes a question of the death penalty. And as I said earlier in the segment, this is a guy, when the verdict came forward, he said, "Sentence me to death. I don't want to take up any more of the court's resources." What do you make of that statement, and will that affect the decision to actually sentence him to death?
It very well could. I mean, you look at mitigating factors when determining whether or not the death penalty is appropriate in murder-related convictions. And so when you put forth no evidence that there are any mitigating factors, then the judge and jury have very little to go on when trying to determine whether or not the death penalty is appropriate.
Okay, so let's take it from a layman's perspective. I'm not a lawyer in this instance, okay? I hear this and I'm thinking, okay, this guy just said he wants to be sentenced to death. Do we even have to go through a whole procedure, a whole separate trial to determine with mitigating factors, aggravating factors? Can't we just sentence him to death if that's what he wants?
It's just not how it works. And so the answer is the sentencing portion of the trial will be protracted because there won't be any mitigating factors presented by the defense, but you still have to go through the process of determining whether or not the death penalty is appropriate in a case like this.
And so his statements could be used against him in a way.
And they could also be used on appeal when invariably the defendant changes his mind and says, "Oh, I'm not fit for the death penalty," or "I'm not mentally fit for it," or has some mitigating factor come to light after he's already sentenced. That could be used potentially in an appeal.
You know, it's interesting. The judge said when he made these statements, he goes, "You might be talking out of emotion right now. You might want to consult with your lawyers before you say anything."
That's right.
So again, probably with what you just had in mind. But you've listened to this case. You've heard the testimony. I thought it was an extremely strong case against Mr. Toledo. This brutal crime against these two young children and his wife seems to be very strong aggravating circumstances, especially in terms of the kids, to sentence him to death. What do you think the mitigating circumstances could be?
Well, in this particular case, I don't know if there are any, but mitigating circumstances generally entail circumstances associated with the death, family and the victims, statements and impact statements of the people affected by the defendant's life, and those sorts of things. So you look at a number of different factors to determine whether or not the death penalty is appropriate for a murder defendant.
Let me ask you this. Okay, this guy put on a whole trial. He could have easily pled guilty. That might have influenced the decision that might have maybe changed a little bit of the factors going into the death penalty, because here the guy just pleads guilty. He feels remorse for what he did. I imagine that might be a factor, but this is a guy who went through a whole trial and declared his innocence and pointed the finger at another person in his case. And only when he was convicted did he then say, just sentence me to death. I don't sense the remorse. I don't sense the kind of characters that would be brought out in maybe testimony to see what kind of person Willis Toledo is. I don't see that kind of those kind of factors that you see in other death penalty cases, but I could be wrong. What do you make of that?
The only factor that I could potentially see in this case is the only mitigating factor is mental ability to be able to serve a death sentence. And so, generally speaking, courts don't like to serve the death sentence on mentally incapable individuals. And so, he didn't make that argument, though, at the underlying trial. So that could be the only argument I could foresee his counsel trying to make in this case without his authority, potentially without his authority, but I don't even think that they're going to make it. I think there's a very strong chance he receives a death penalty in this case.
Let's talk about the jury for a second. In Florida just had this new law. They caught up with the rest of the nation. Now you need a unanimous jury verdict. to determine a unanimous jury decision for the death penalty. That can't be an easy decision for people to make, to sentence someone to death. What do you make of that in terms of a jury? It's in their hands to determine this. That can't be an easy task, and if you need a unanimous decision, I don't know if you'd be able to get it. What do you think?
In this particular case, I think the chances of getting it are greater than the chances of not getting it. But look, in all death sentences, a unanimous jury decision should be required, and it's because the death sentence is not something that a country like the United States should be handing out on a regular basis. It's something that should be unique and reserved for the most heinous of crimes. And so this does reach that level potentially, and I think that there's a good chance that a jury finds that Mr. Toledo should be serving the death penalty, especially because he won't be submitting any mitigating factors whatsoever in his defense.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, we'll have to see what happens in that case, and as soon as we do have coverage of that, we're going to turn to it. Hopefully we'll have you on to talk about that. But I do want to switch over now to Jeffrey Willis, this horrific, bizarre case out of Michigan. You know, Adam, let's talk about where we're at right now. We're kind of going towards the end of this case.
Right.
We know that there's emotion. We'll talk about that today, why we don't have live coverage today, why the trial's not going on today. But let's talk about where we're at. The defense is going to be closing their case. I think they said they might call 2 more witnesses and then close their case, and then you'll have closing arguments. I have to say, the prosecution's case is pretty strong. What, in my opinion, and what I've seen other people say, is that the 2 strongest pieces of evidence against Mr. Willis in terms of the Blech murder is the ballistics test matched the gun found in his minivan to the one used to kill Blech, as well as the expert testimony from Friday that Blech's DNA was found on a sex toy and glove recovered from Willis's minivan. Are those 2 factors just impossible to argue away for the defense?
I think they are. DNA evidence is always the death knell in these murder cases. If you got DNA evidence tying the defendant to the victim, chances are you're going to get convicted in a case like that. And this seems like as open and shut a case you can have.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. I mean, this is a guy who tried to point the finger at his cousin, Kevin Bloom. And Kevin Bloom had an alibi that panned out. He was at his, I think his daughter's soccer game, and there was evidence that he was there. There's no evidence attaching Mr. Blum to this crime. And I want to talk about the motion that we have right now, why there's a delay right now. The delay centers around an evidence motion by the defense to admit some statements that Willis's cousin, Kevin Bloom, made to investigators. And apparently they wanted to introduce about 18 hours worth of Blum's 18 hours worth of Blum's statements as evidence, and now they're trying to work it down to bring it down a little bit. But what are they trying to hopefully get? Unless Kevin Blum is on tape somewhere saying I did this 100%, and I framed my cousin, what are they hoping to get out of this?
They're hoping to get confusion, Jesse. I mean, that's what every defense attorney wants. They want enough confusion to create some semblance of reasonable doubt. They want to say, do you remember on the 13th hour of the tape of the cousin where he said something ambiguous which could potentially mean that he committed the murder instead of Mr. Willis? And so that's what they're trying to do. They're taking a case that seems pretty open and shut, and they're trying to make hay where no hay can really be made. And I think that Mr. Willis is in trouble.
Let's try to make sense about this a little bit, because it gets kind of confusing. You have 3 separate incidents talked about in one trial. Kevin Bloom, he was charged as an accessory after the fact in Jessica Haringa's murder, because he told police that he helped Willis bury her body. Now, he was originally convicted of lying to the police. He tried to show them where the body was. They weren't there. He was convicted of lying to the police. Then there was a separate hearing about whether he could also be charged with accessory after the fact, and it appears he wasn't charged with accessory after the fact, and the reason was because he apparently was involved in disposing of this body. So we know that he's somehow involved in the Jessica Haringa disappearance. Okay, that's one factor. He was asked to testify Friday in this case, the Rebecca Blech murder, and he invoked his Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination. As an attorney, what does that tell you in connection what is there something that he's trying to hide? You know, again, he's connected to Willis. He's connected to Willis in this other crime, but now he pled the Fifth in this crime. What's happening here? Try to make sense of it for our viewers.
Pleading the fifth is nothing that, this is a real problem, I think, in the criminal justice system. Pleading the fifth is not something that you can glean information from. Pleading the fifth is something that that people that have been accused of crimes can do to not incriminate themselves. And so even if you're not guilty, you can plead the fifth. And so there should be no people, juries, the public should take nothing from the fact that people plead the fifth, because you are entitled under the Constitution of the United States to be able to keep your mouth quiet and not incriminate yourself. Whether you're guilty or not, you can keep your mouth quiet when asked for information that could potentially be incriminating. And so there's nothing that can really be taken from that as a matter of law.
Let's talk about the idea that, okay, so we know that he's connected to one of these crimes. That makes sense what you said.
That's right.
But here's the problem. I've never seen a case where it was almost like three cases are tried in one, three separate incidents. Did you take issue with that at all? The fact that, okay, this is a guy, Jeffrey Willis, the prosecution's trying to show a pattern with this guy, that if you can link him to the potential kidnapping of that teenager, you can link him to the Jessica Horinga disappearance and murder, if you can link him to Rebecca Bletch. This is a guy who's a serial predator of women. That's the pattern we're going to show. Now, I have always felt a little uncomfortable about bringing these separate incidents in, but it's a little bit different here because if they are trying to establish a pattern. Do you take issue with the way the prosecution's doing this?
I could see doing it both ways, right? You want to show a pattern or practice because it seems like you're looking for the death penalty or life without parole. And so to get that, I think the prosecution thinks that they need to prove this pattern or practice, and that any one of those crimes by themselves would not give them what they are looking for. And also judicial resources. This is a guy that looks like he's definitely going away for a long time. And if you can consolidate these cases and do them together, you're creating a judicial efficiency, which is important as well. These trials cost a lot of money, take a lot of time, and prevent prosecutors who already have a docket that's very long. They have to, it allows them to get to other cases as well.
So what happens now? If he's convicted of the Rebecca Bletch murder, how does that affect the testimony, the evidence that's brought in for the trials that he's going to be on for the abduction of that teenager and the Jessica Horinga disappearance? How does this work? How is this all connected then moving forward? If they were able to bring it in this case, are they able to bring it in the next cases?
Yes, of course. So, well, if he's convicted, of course. If he's not convicted, they can't do anything with it. So it really depends how this one goes. This is the first is always the most important. So
let's get this straight. If he's not convicted, right?
Right.
He's still going to be on trial for Horinga and
Correct.
the teenager. But it changes the flavor of it a little bit, does it not? I mean, but the juries on those cases, they might not necessarily have known he was ever on trial for Rebecca Bletch, right? They shouldn't have, or if they do the proper jury selection. You want a jury that doesn't know,
right.
as you want as least of information about Jeffrey Willis as possible.
That's right, if he's not convicted, right? So if he is convicted, then that conviction will go to show a pattern of practice in the next trial. If he's not convicted, then any reasonable jury should know nothing about the first trial. And so that's going to be hard to find, especially given the press associated with this trial.
Yeah, I think he's become infamous in Michigan for all the wrong reasons.
That's right.
So that's not going to be great for him. What do you think, in your opinion?
They can always move the trial, though.
They could, to a different county, to a different venue, and try to, but again, it might be tough because not only is everyone in the nation following this case, because it's so quite disturbing, but if I was living in the state, I probably would have heard about it. This is a pretty infamous kind of character. I do have a question. What do you think, besides the ballistics, besides the DNA linking Rebecca Bletch to the items in his van, what, in your opinion, is another piece of incriminating evidence against Mr. Willis? Is it the file, the computer file that was found, the folder on his hard drive that had Vicks on it, the label for victims? Was it his search history? Is it what he was involved in? What do you sense, if you're a juror in this case, is really, it's just adding up, it's a good supporting, corroborating evidence for this guy?
Search history really isn't something that I think that is going to support the prosecution's case, but the victim file is very damning if you ask me. I think it's plain as day what that file was for, but I think, I know we're talking about other evidence, but the DNA evidence to me is the most damning evidence that is out there against Mr. Willis. I think that that really ties the victim to the defendant, and I think that's where his biggest trouble is going to be. I don't think you need much more than that.
Yeah, we're talking about that folder in this hard drive that was labeled VICS, V-I-C-S, which is short for victims, and subfolders labeled with the initials of Blech and Haringa, as well as code for the dates of their deaths. Again, why would someone have this unless they're intimately involved in these events? I want to talk a little bit about Charlene Bishop. That was Mr. Willis's ex-wife. She testified that she received a letter from Mr. Willis after he was arrested while he was in jail, and she felt that in the letter, it felt like he was planting memories in a way that he was corroborating his story, giving himself an alibi. What did you think about that? We always talk about the fact that when you have spouses, that people that you're actually married to, they're not compelled to testify against you, but this is his ex-wife now. This is a woman who knows his most intimate secrets. What did you take from her testimony?
This is what I took. I took that Mr. Willis might actually be a sociopath, and sociopaths do everything they can to try to control and manipulate their victims and the people around them to do what it is they want them to do. And that letter is just another piece of evidence to show, in my opinion, that he will do whatever it takes to keep himself out of prison. He thinks he's smarter than everyone. He thinks he's better than everyone. And that's what sociopaths do.
Let's not forget this guy also it was brought up in this trial that he collected the underwear of a coworker, Michelle Shontala. Also, there was a handwriting analyst who testified that Willis wrote a note found in a trash barrel in his late grandfather's house. The list, according to this testimony, had such things written on it as handcuffs, sex toys, gasoline, matches, ball gag, and her panties, in quotation marks, neck restraint, and cameras. What kind of party was this guy involved in? And it's one I don't think anybody wanted an invitation to.
I mean, could this case be any stronger? I mean, what more do you need to convict the guy? It does not seem like this is going to be a case where you'll be waiting very long for the jury to make its determination. I don't think there are going to be many holdouts in this one.
Now, the defense, I think this is a tough battle for them. They questioned the accuracy of DNA collection and testing. They asked why the victim, Rebecca Blech's DNA, wasn't found on her own sunglasses and earbuds, and the DNA analyst said that they only tested a certain section of the headphone cord, not the earbuds themselves. I suppose they're just trying to point at anything, trying to show that you didn't properly test it, but is that really ever effective in a case where you have such strong evidence like this, or is it really just grasping at straws?
Look, you have to do your job as a defense attorney. Everyone has a constitutional right to a defense, and so if you're going to be a defense attorney, you have to deal with the facts that are presented to you. This seems like as open and shut a case as you can have. And so a defense attorney needs to be able to take whatever is available to them, 18 hours of testimony from a cousin, and do whatever they can to confuse and conflate issues so that they can create some degree of reasonable doubt. And I think that's really what the prosecutor is going to say at the end of the day. You've heard a bunch of gobbledygook from the defendant doing whatever he can to keep himself out of prison, but nothing he says supports his position that there is any reasonable doubt in this case.
Yeah, I agree with you. So you're saying it's going to be an uphill battle for the defense. They're going to be carrot calling, I believe, 2 more witnesses. Hopefully, they're going to get that motion resolved pretty soon so that they will resume testimony where they can introduce statements of Kevin Blum. And their only hope is to somehow try to create a confusion, as you said, about Kevin Blum and what his statements meant and what his involvement was in this crime. That's their only hope moving forward, because otherwise I don't know what they're going to be able to do.
That's right. There's really nothing else for them to do. I mean, they'll call their witnesses, they'll present their testimony, but at the end of the day, it looks like this guy's going to prison.
Yeah. All right, let's preview another case, Adam, that we're going to be covering, the Adam Matos case. This is the case out of Pasco County, Florida. Adam Matos has been accused of brutally murdering his ex-girlfriend, Megan Brown, her boyfriend, Nicholas Leonard, and her parents, Gregory and Margaret Brown. Now, this gentleman, along with his ex-girlfriend, they have a son who was 4 years old at the time his mother was murdered. He faces the death penalty. We're previewing this case from what you've read about it, from what you've seen about it. We're really just beginning the jury selection. Jury selection started happening yesterday. What do you expect from this case when we actually start covering it?
There's going to be a lot of drama on this one. You have an aggrieved family on the victim side, especially when you get to sentencing, should they get that far, you're going to have a lot of testimony against this guy and how he's affected families and family members. It's going to be bad for him, I think.
Yeah, because I'm thinking about it, and look, we haven't heard any testimony yet. I've only had a brief instance to look at some of the evidence. I see a situation where this is a very personal crime, Adam. I see Megan Brown died of a gunshot wound to the head. That's his ex-girlfriend. Her father died of a gunshot wound to the torso. Her mother, whose hands were found bound behind her back and her head covered with a bag, died of blunt force trauma to the head and asphyxiation. And her boyfriend died of blunt force trauma to the head. This is a personal crime against a series of family members and another boyfriend. The ex-boyfriend here, Mr. Matos, who else would have done it besides him? That's my theory. My initial impression is this is a very personal crime against these individuals who are all together. Is that what you see?
It's a little early for me to tell. We need to hear a little bit more testimony. It's hard to prejudge some of these cases without actually seeing it. Does it seem likely that it's a scorned lover or grieved ex-boyfriend that committed a crime like this? Yes. Can we say that for certain at this point without seeing the evidence? Clearly not.
What about the idea that we know Miss Brown contacted individuals before this horrific murder took place, saying that she felt her life was in danger? She felt that her life was in danger from her boyfriend, her ex-boyfriend, excuse me. In fact, the sheriff's office received a call from Brown about an aggravated assault. Brown told deputies at that point that Matos had a knife to her throat and threatened to kill her. But later on that day, Brown allegedly told her friend, Tanya Carlson, that Adam was acting crazy and she's never seen him act like this and he's going to kill me. She even told her boss, Megan Brown told her boss that she was scared and thought that Matos was going to kill her. All these statements that were allegedly made, if they're put into evidence, how does that help the jury in making a decision?
Well, look, it's additional evidence that it was Mr. Matos that committed this heinous, absolutely brutal crime. It seems like it was him. It seems like Mr. Matos committed the crime, but it's like I said, it's too early to tell. That kind of evidence is going to be pretty damning, and they're going to have to come up with a pretty good alibi for Mr. Matos if he's going to get out of this.
Yeah, it's pretty graphic from what we've seen of this case, and just like listening to a little bit of the evidence and what's been happening. Their bodies were decomposed. They were covered in maggots. It's pretty disturbing. We're gonna have to hear what happens with it. I hate hearing these cases, but it's one of those cases where you try to make sense of what happened and why. But we'll have to see. It's not an easy case. Adam, let's talk about our final point of the day. I want to talk about the Robert Mueller investigation. So what we have is Paul Manafort. For anybody who hasn't heard this, and this was all in the news yesterday. Paul Manafort, President Trump's former campaign manager, and his business associate Rick Gates were indicted yesterday on multiple charges. These included money laundering, operating as federal agents of the Ukrainian government, failing to disclose overseas bank accounts, and making false statements to federal authorities. But that's not it. We also learned that President Trump's campaign foreign policy advisor, George Papadopoulos, pled guilty earlier this month for lying to the FBI about his contacts with Russian officials. We're going to break this down from a legal aspect because I think people can get kind of confused about what's happening, how is everything connected. Let's start with Paul Manafort and Rick Gates. What's going on? What were they convicted of? Is this just a tax evasion case? Were they just trying to conceal money? Is there more going on? Please just explain to our viewers what's going on with these two guys.
Well, as of right now, it's an indictment, and so they've gone through the process of going to a grand jury who is presented with evidence and has a very low threshold for granting the special prosecutor the right to indict Mr. Gates and Mr. Mueller. This has little to do, however, with Donald Trump and his inner sphere during the pendency of the campaign related to any payments or coercion with Russia to obtain information about Hillary Clinton's candidacy. And so President Trump jumped on that when given the opportunity on Twitter, immediately following the Gates and Mueller investigation and indictment. However, what Mr. Trump was not prepared for was the indictment of Mr. Papadopoulos, his one of the members of his foreign policy team during the campaign. I think that's the far more interesting indictment.
We'll talk about that in a minute. We'll bring in that. I want to
Okay.
understand this about Robert Mueller,
Sure.
excuse me. Now, if I read this correctly, his goal, his task was to investigate anything that had related to the Trump campaign and Russia, the contacts, any potential collusion. We'll talk about what that means. My question is, how far is his scope to investigate crimes here? Because if you said, and as we saw in the news, these crimes that Paul Manafort and Rick Gates were indicted for, as you said, they had nothing to do with the actual election. They had nothing to do with the campaign. How far does his scope go? And is this just the starting ground for other people that might be that come into his warpath in a way? Is there other people that will be indicted that are maybe have committed some sort of crimes, but are that unrelated to the Trump campaign or the presidential election? So are we expecting more indictments, you think, that have something to do with illegal ties or hiding assets or hiding income or lying to federal authorities? Where does Robert Mueller's scope end?
We are absolutely expecting more indictments in this case. And so the people that need to be the most afraid, I think, are Jared Kushner and Donald Trump Jr. I think those two should be very afraid about the possibility of potentially being indicted for similar crimes against the United States. So where does the indictment end and where does Mr. Mueller's investigation begin? It is broad-ranging. He has the authority to investigate anything Russia-related. And so when he indicts Paul Manafort and Mr. Gates, he's saying that my investigation does not start and stop with President Trump's campaign. It goes far beyond that. It goes before the campaign, any financial related issues as well, which is also something that should scare Trump. As of today, we've never seen Trump's tax returns, which was a big issue, as you recall, from the campaign. However, Mr. Mueller may have access to those returns and may be looking deeply into Trump's past to determine whether or not he had inappropriate conduct or unlawful conduct with Russia or any other financially related unlawful conduct. And so that's something that should scare him, the fact that he went beyond that Mr. Mueller in his investigation went beyond the campaign itself.
But let's make sure I understand this correctly. So Acting Attorney General Rod Rosenstein's order to the special counsel authorizes Robert Mueller to investigate any other matters that arose or may arise directly from the investigation. But it's my understanding that a special counsel can only investigate crimes, correct? It can't be anything further than that. It actually has to rise to the level of criminal behavior. So if in his investigation he uncovers evidence of criminal behavior from any individual tied to this investigation, that's a pretty broad scope. So in other words, he has a broad blanket to look at something. Anybody that did something criminal, he can file charges and get a grand jury to indict. Is that the way that I'm understanding it? He does have the authority for a wide scope here?
Sure, and you saw it yesterday. He's utilizing the outer reaches of the scope associated with the order by Rod Rosenstein and the U.S. Department of Justice. He is given carte blanche to basically look at any crimes related to Russia. And so whether it's related to the campaign or before the campaign and the laundering of money, he has the authority to go and indict. And the real question is he indicting Gates and Manafort for the purpose of turning them on higher level officials, or is he indicting them because he wants to see them in prison?
Well,
only time will tell.
So, yes, but here's the question that I have for you about that. If that's the case, to turn them, would this have become as public? Correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not sure I fully understand, but we knew that charges were going to be filed on yesterday. We knew it on Friday, that we knew that activity was going to happen on Monday. Couldn't he have kept it more secret then if he wanted these guys to turn into informants against people? Couldn't he have made plea deals with them beforehand? We know that Manafort and Gates have pled not guilty. Papadopoulos has been pled guilty. What do you think about that?
Look, I think that he may have tried to turn them and couldn't thus far, but when you are publicly facing life imprisonment, 20 years to life in prison, things can drastically change for you when you are publicly facing that kind of jail sentence. And so, they may have needed more pressure than Papadopoulos needed to get them to turn. And, the people that have had any correspondence with Papadopoulos in the last 4 or 5 months need to be very scared about what they've said to him, because pretty much everything they've said, I assume, has gotten back to Mueller, and so, or has been audio taped. And so it's something that I think that there are definitely some people in the Trump sphere that are very nervous about what's going on right now.
What are the charges against Paul Manafort and Rick Gates here? Is it that, let's break it down for our viewers to make sure they understand what they've actually been charged with and what they could face prison time for. Let's break it down. They concealed information from federal authorities, and they concealed money that they had earned during their lobbying efforts in connection with Ukraine. Maybe you could tease that out a little bit about
Sure.
what they're actually charged with.
Sure. So the principal charge is tax evasion, right? So they're earning tens of millions of dollars and utilizing that money to buy property and bring over to the United States without paying taxes on it. It's a common tax evasion scheme. The reason why it's relatable to the Trump investigation, the reason why Mueller is involved, is because it relates to Russia. Even though it was before the campaign, it still relates to Russia. And so that is the principal claim that they're making against Mueller. There are others as well, but that's the principal one that I think has the most chance, that has the greatest chance of sticking.
So, and the idea that this is where I thought it got very interesting, is that these two guys have a consulting firm, and they were asked twice by the Justice Department for any records that they had on their past Ukrainian lobbying effort, and they responded that their company policy, their consulting firm, they don't retain communications beyond 30 days, so research returned no responsive documents. But it was learned through the indictment that at least some of those records were stashed in Paul Manafort's home, and we know that home was raided. That's a pretty big deal, no?
It's a huge deal. I mean, for Robert Mueller to be taking that step to raid the home of the former chairman of President Trump's campaign is unbelievable and unprecedented. It looks like we're back in the time of Nixon. It seems like it's just a matter of time till Trump's inner circle starts getting their indictments handed to him.
I want to focus on that raid. This raid that happened on July 26, FBI agents busted into Manafort's home in Alexandria, Virginia, to collect documents and other materials related to the FBI probe. There's been a question, we raised it on our website, about any Fourth Amendment issues that there might have been, because what we seem to know from an earlier report is that Mueller's investigators took documents that were considered to be covered by the attorney-client privilege, and lawyers from a law firm that were representing Manafort at the time warned his office that their search warrant didn't allow access to attorney materials. Now, is there a violation of the Fourth Amendment here, or is this just a mistake? Hey, we're sorry, we picked up some items that we shouldn't have picked up, or is it a little bit more problematic in the sense that they had warning beforehand not to look at any materials, and they did?
If Paul Manafort ends up seeing a jury verdict in this case, we will definitely be right back here on this show debating whether or not the motion to preclude that evidence at trial will be granted or not, I promise you, because they are going to make a lot of hay out of it, because I would imagine that a lot of their investigation relates back to those documents that they took from his home. And so if that warrant was inappropriate or overly broad in scope, and the judge precludes evidence from being presented at trial, it's going to be a problem for the prosecution.
Adam, Jason Maloney, who's a spokesman for Manafort, he said in an email statement yesterday, Mr. Manafort represented pro-European Union campaigns for the Ukrainians, and in the course of that representation, he was seeking only to further democracy and to help the Ukrainians come closer to the United States and the EU. Furthermore, a claim that maintaining offshore accounts to bring all your funds into the United States as a scheme to conceal from the United States government is ridiculous. This appears to be an appetizer to the defense that Manafort and Gates will be using, because they pled not guilty. What do you take from that statement? And ultimately, how are they going to defend themselves against these charges?
It's just right out of the Trump playbook. You know, the playbook is either outright untruthful information where you say something that's just completely inaccurate and hope that the general public doesn't understand what it is that's actually being said, or to just confuse and conflate issues to the point where you call it a tie when you know you're playing from behind. And so, you know, he's just taking that right out of the Trump playbook.
Is there any way from these charges, I'm sure you've seen these kind of charges brought against people before, you know, tax evasion, lying to federal authorities. What are defenses to this? How do you see people crafting defenses, maybe not just specifically from what I said, but is there other defenses that we're not thinking of right now?
It's going to be nuanced statutory law. They're going to say that they were not actually laundering money because some nuance or some esoteric portion of the tax code, that they were doing what was appropriate because of some deduction or some, you know, workaround around the tax code. I think that's going to be their best defense.
Does that work?
No, not often. I mean, you know, Al Capone was able to dodge numerous murder raps in his career, but you know what ultimately brought him to prison for over 20 years. Tax fraud. Yeah,
that's a very good point. Very good point. Let's bring it back to what you said earlier about President Trump's campaign foreign policy advisor, George Papadopoulos. Can you just explain to our viewers? So this guy pled guilty to a single charge of making a false statement to the FBI in early 2017. What's going on with him? What exactly did he lie about? Did he lie about the nature of his connections to these foreign governments, these foreign officials? Did he lie about certain meetings? What's going on with him?
Both. And so he lied to the FBI. He got a plea deal because he lied to the FBI about his Russian contacts and his communications with the Trump organization and the Trump inner sphere about his contacts with Russia and attempts to get information to smear then presidential candidate Hillary Clinton. And so he entered into a plea deal where he is helping the special prosecutor get evidence. And the most fascinating part about this is that none of that was leaked. None of the news organizations had any idea that Papadopoulos had been working with Special Prosecutor Mueller, and I believe that is what is going to be creating the most fear in the Trump organization, because it shows that if you're lying to the FBI, they will prosecute you, one, for lying, and two, that they've got a line into at least the outer orbit of Trump's circle.
Why, in your estimation, would he have lied about this?
Well, the same reason that most people lie. They're either afraid of what the truth actually means for them, and they get afraid.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about that sphere. Let's talk about where we're going from this. This Mueller indictment, we know that it could pose difficult questions for multiple people. But one of the interesting characters that we saw yesterday that it might pose an interesting question for is the Podesta Group, which is headed by Tony Podesta, and he was a major Hillary Clinton fundraiser, supporter and brother of Clinton campaign chairman John Podesta. Now we know that his group was actually connected with this in some way. You know, they conducted a Ukrainian lobbying effort. They never registered with the Justice Department as a foreign agent because they said that they had been assured by the European Center for a Modern Ukraine that they thought that this was an independent group created by Ukrainian businessmen, and it was not controlled or financed by a foreign government. So they thought that they were doing the right thing. They didn't think that they were a foreign agent. But according to the indictment that we saw, this European center that they were involved in was a front group that was under the ultimate direction of the government of Ukraine. What do you make of this in terms of Mr. Podesta, his liability moving forward? And I'm going to posit this question to you, Adam. We know that people in the Trump administration or the people in the Trump camp are really looking at this indictment. But what does this mean for Hillary Clinton? What does this mean for Mr. Podesta? Do we look for anybody that had some sort of connection to Russia, Ukraine, something there that okay, they have to be on alert as well? Will they face charges as well?
I don't think so. I don't think it's going to be a principal component of the investigation. Look, Hillary Clinton lost the election. She is now just a private citizen who has no political influence really, or doesn't have the same political influence that she once had. I don't think that that will be the principal focus of the investigation. I do think that if it becomes a principal focus, it won't get any higher than Tony Podesta. I don't think that there's going to be any evidence that Hillary Clinton conspired with Russia to get information. And I frankly don't think that there's going to be any evidence that Tony Podesta did either. I think that this is a tactic by the Trump organization to confuse and conflate issues and to get back into campaign mode, which is where Trump thrives, where he has a singular enemy to fight. And so he doesn't want that enemy to be Mueller. He wants that enemy to be shifted back to Hillary Clinton. He wants to shift the blame back to her. But at this point, does the American public really care about Hillary Clinton, a private citizen who is no longer a presidential candidate? I think the general public cares about what happened with the President of the United States, what he knew, and what his inner sphere knew.
But Adam, isn't the counter-argument be that if we're investigating alleged illegal ties to foreign governments and trying to see any evidence of wrongdoing, then anybody who comes into this purview, whether it was related to the Trump campaign or not, that's why it matters that we have Paul Manafort being indicted, Rick Gates being indicted. So how would you respond to all this news that came out that there's this alleged ties that the Clinton campaign and the DNC funneled millions of dollars to sources in order to obtain this Trump dossier, or this evidence that that Clinton used her office as Secretary of State to confer benefits to Russia in exchange for money, in exchange for donations to her foundation? I mean, we heard this evidence. I think people are still trying to work through it, but it all ties in, I guess, into the conversation about Russia and the Ukraine and what's happening here. So my question is it still possible, in light of this evidence that's coming out, that it wouldn't be impossible for Mueller to find something that might make him sniff towards the Clintons and their foundation?
Yes, it's totally possible. It's totally possible. If it's at all Russia related, he has the right and obligation to vet it and figure out whether or not there has been criminal activity. Whether or not he stays focused on the Trump campaign is going to be entirely up to what evidence he finds. He could focus on the Clinton campaign as well. If I was a betting man, I would think that more than not, the indictments that you'll be seeing coming out in the future are going to be those from the Trump campaign, though.
Adam, my final question to you, and thanks for joining us here and talking about all these topics. We keep hearing this term collusion, okay? This is a law show. Is there a legal definition for collusion? I keep hearing yes, I keep hearing no. Is it based in the statutes? What does it really mean when we say collusion?
It's vague under the law, but collusion is basically working with any foreign government or entity in an effort to persuade or influence American democracy, specifically in this case elections. And so the question is whether or not Trump or anyone from his sphere worked with a foreign government, Russia or Russian operatives, to obtain information to smear his opponent, and that would be considered collusion. But it's vague because it's not something that happens often. How many times have you heard of presidential candidates even being alleged to have colluded with a foreign government to influence an election?
It's unprecedented. It is unprecedented, and that's why I'm glad we have you on to break down these issues, because it can get kind of complicated. You hear these terms thrown out, there's all these different characters, and I think you provided some clarity for our viewers who are listening to this and following this and joining us here on the Law News Network. So Adam Gana, managing partner of Gana LLP, thank you so much for coming on to talk about Luis Toledo, Jeffrey Willis, Paul Manafort, Robert Mueller investigation, and Adam Matos. We really appreciate you coming on, and thank you so much.
My pleasure, Jesse. Thank you.
Thank you.